Most organizations treat corporate social responsibility like a marketing layer, a glossy PDF, a donation, a press release, and a net zero badge for the website. They are wrong. CSR is a governance system under constraint, and the constraint is getting physical: power, water, land, and carbon. In this episode, Microsoft is the case study, and we'll use 3 operational artifacts: the sustainability report, the internal carbon fee, and cloud for sustainability. Here's the open loop. Microsoft promised carbon negative, yet its emissions still rose. That tension is the audit. CSR in one clean definition. CSR, stripped of slogans, is simple. A company makes business decisions that account for societal impact, not just profit. Not donations, not awareness campaigns, decisions. And decisions only matter when they change trade-offs inside the system. The common framing is the triple bottom line: people, planet, profit. Most executives say it like a mantra, then go back to a single bottom line with nicer typography. The more accurate way to treat it is as an operating model: 3 constraint domains that compete for priority every time a team ships a product, chooses a supplier, or builds a data center. People means the company's footprint on humans, employees, customers, communities, and the extended workforce in the supply chain. In practice, this includes wages, safety, diversity, accessibility, and how the company responds when incentives produce harm. Planet means the company's physical footprint: emissions, water use, waste, land use, and the resource extraction hidden behind digital. Profit means the company stays solvent and scalable. CSR doesn't remove profit. It removes the fantasy that profit is the only variable that deserves deterministic control. There's also a useful vocabulary split. 4 types of CSR you'll hear repeatedly: environmental, ethical, philanthropic, and economic. Environmental is the obvious one: emissions, energy, water, waste. Ethical is how the company behaves when nobody is watching: labor standards, privacy, procurement integrity, and avoiding the predictable exploitation that shows up wherever pressure meets opacity. Philanthropic is what most people mistake for CSR: giving money, volunteering, community programs. It can be good, it can also be camouflage. And economic responsibility is the uncomfortable part: running the business in a way that doesn't externalize costs onto society and then call the externalization innovation. Here's the thing most people miss: CSR becomes real only when it becomes measurable. The moment you can measure something, you can budget it. The moment you can budget it, you can enforce it. And the moment you can enforce it, it stops being culture and becomes control. That's why sustainability reports matter, even when they're annoying to read. They're not inspirational literature. They're a public interface to an internal accounting system. They declare boundaries, define scopes, and force a company to put numbers where it previously put adjectives. They also reveal where the company refuses measurement, which is usually where the real risk lives. Measurement changes everything. You get baselines, targets, deltas, and accountability cycles. Teams stop saying "we care" and start saying "we're up 12% year over year, and here's why." That isn't virtue, that is operational reality. And it sets the stage for the only question that matters: do the numbers change decisions, or do they just decorate the narrative? This is the uncomfortable truth. In 2026, CSR exists because constraints arrived, not because executives collectively became enlightened. Customers ask for disclosures, employees ask whether they're building something defensible, investors ask about risk exposure, regulators ask for auditable reporting, and physics asks for payment eventually, because data centers are not metaphors. They're industrial facilities that consume power, water, and hardware at a scale that makes sustainability an architecture problem. So when this episode calls CSR control, it's not a rhetorical trick. It's describing the system's actual function. CSR is the control plane for non-financial risk: human risk, environmental risk, reputational risk, and regulatory risk. If the control plane is weak, policy drifts, exceptions accumulate, and you end up with conditional chaos, claims that sound coherent while the underlying flows do whatever they want. Now we can talk about Microsoft without getting hypnotized by branding. We'll treat Microsoft's sustainability story as what it is: an attempt to build a carbon control plane that makes infrastructure decisions uncomfortable in the right places. That distinction matters. Why environmental responsibility became a business imperative. Environmental responsibility didn't become a business imperative because the corporate world discovered a conscience. It became imperative because stakeholders turned environmental impact into a requirement that shows up in deals, hiring, capital, and law. The system tightened. The margin for vibes disappeared. Start with customers, because customers now run procurement like an audit committee. Large buyers ask suppliers for emissions disclosures, targets, and progress. Sometimes it's formal questionnaires, sometimes it's contractual language. Either way, it changes the sales motion. You're no longer selling just capability, you're selling capability under constraint. If your sustainability posture can't survive a spreadsheet, you don't just lose reputation, you lose revenue. And when the largest buyers behave that way, it cascades through the supply chain until environmental responsibility stops being optional and becomes table stakes. Then there's employees, which executives still underestimate because they treat it as culture instead of labor economics. Talent markets, especially in the knowledge economy, don't just price compensation, they price alignment and risk. People don't want to spend 5 years building systems that will be politically toxic, regulatorily constrained, or morally indefensible on a bad day. Millennials and Gen Z don't need to be romanticized here. The only relevant fact is that they ask different questions and they ask them earlier. They want to see evidence, not pledges. A sustainability narrative that can't survive internal scrutiny becomes a retention problem. And retention problems become productivity problems, which turn into product problems, which then become financial problems. It's not ideology, it's throughput. Investors show up next and they bring the coldest logic of all, risk pricing. They don't need to believe in sustainability to punish you for unmanaged exposure. Climate risk shows up as operational risk, supply chain risk, energy price volatility, insurance friction, and future compliance costs. A company that can't articulate its emissions profile is signaling something worse than environmental negligence. It's signaling that it can't measure itself. And any system that can't measure itself can't control itself. Capital hates that. Regulation is the final forcing function because regulators don't care about your brand story. They care about traceability and comparability. Reporting requirements turn narrative into liability. Once you publish a metric, you've created a promise that can be examined, challenged, and used against you later. That changes corporate behavior fast, not because companies fear shame, but because they fear enforcement and litigation. It's the same reason security programs mature. The threat model eventually includes auditors. Now here's the pivot that most CSR conversations avoid. Environmental responsibility became a business imperative because sustainability moved into the core machinery: procurement, architecture, and finance. Those three domains decide what an organization actually does. Everything else is commentary. Procurement is where sustainability stops being a poster and becomes a filter. If you require suppliers to disclose emissions, you're not just collecting data, you're reshaping the market around you. Suppliers either adapt or they get replaced. That is governance via purchasing power. And it's brutal in the way all incentives are brutal. It doesn't care about intent, only compliance. Architecture is where sustainability becomes physical. Cloud systems feel abstract until you look at the data center: power delivery, cooling, water, hardware life cycles, and land. The industry spent a decade selling digital transformation like it was weightless. It isn't. Cloud is an industrialization of compute, and AI is an intensification of that industrialization. When power becomes scarce or politically contested, the architecture stops being a purely technical choice and becomes a capacity planning problem with public consequences. Latency and resiliency still matter, but now they're joined by something that doesn't negotiate: energy. Finance is the last piece because finance turns values into behavior. If sustainability lives in a report, it's optional. If sustainability lives in a budget line, it's real. The moment carbon has an internal price, engineers feel it without being asked to care. That's the uncomfortable trick. You don't scale ethical awareness, you scale incentives. And that's why old school CSR marketing fails under modern constraints. It tells a story, but it doesn't change decisions. It adds a layer of language over a system whose defaults still optimize for speed and revenue. Over time, that mismatch creates drift. The brand claims one thing, the operational graph does another. The world notices, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. So the business imperative isn't be sustainable. The imperative is remain governable in a world where sustainability is enforced by customers, employees, investors, and regulators. Microsoft sits in the center of that pressure. It sells compute at planetary scale, therefore it can't treat sustainability as a side program. It has to treat it like a control plane. Next, we draw the fraud boundary. What counts as impact and what counts as theater. CSR marketing versus measurable impact, the fraud boundary. Most organizations don't lie about CSR in the dramatic cartoon way. They do something more operationally dangerous. They tell the story first and they negotiate measurement later. That ordering matters because once the story exists, everything underneath starts optimizing to protect it. Metrics become accessories, definitions become flexible, boundaries become negotiable, and the CSR program slowly turns into a distributed narrative engine that can survive almost any reality, as long as the reality stays hard to audit. This is where greenwashing actually lives, not in one false claim, but in a system design choice. If messaging leads and measurement follows, the company builds a probabilistic truth model. It can always say, we meant this other scope, or we're improving, or we'll get there by 203, because the control plane never had enforcement. It had branding. So here's the fraud boundary. It's not, did they run an ad? Everyone runs ads. The boundary is simpler. Did they change the operating system of decisions, or did they just change the wording around them? A useful test is to ignore the campaign and look for operational artifacts. Budget mechanisms, procurement requirements, engineering gates, audit trails. The thing most people miss is that genuine CSR leaves fingerprints where it hurts. It shows up in the places that teams complain about. It creates friction, it introduces constraints, it makes someone's life harder today so the organization can still function tomorrow. Marketing CSR does the opposite. It removes friction. It tells you the company is committed, so you'll stop asking how it's enforced. That's why the best fraud detector is governance language. Listen for verbs. We support and we care our atmosphere. We require, we charge, we disclose, we verify, we report our structure. And structure is the only thing that survives scale. Now, annual reporting becomes the weirdly important middle layer in this whole game. People treat sustainability reports like PR. They're not. They're report cards, and a report card is an accountability interface. Once a company publishes a boundary, a baseline, and a target, it has created a public contract. Even if nobody reads the report, it exists as an anchor that employees, customers, journalists, and regulators can use later to measure drift. But reporting also has its own failure mode, disclosure theater. A company can disclose endlessly while changing nothing. It can publish attractive charts, heroic goals, and bold commitments while the underlying system stays untouched. It looks like transparency, but it isn't. It's just higher resolution storytelling. So the fraud boundary isn't reporting versus not reporting. It's whether reporting connects to enforcement. If reporting feeds budgets and defaults, it's governance. If reporting feeds slogans, it's decoration. And this is where philanthropy becomes the favorite camouflage layer. Philanthropy can be real good done in the world. It can also be an entropy generator for accountability because it gives the organization an easy moral win that doesn't require changing the core footprint. Donations don't change data center design. Volunteering doesn't change supply chain emissions. A charitable program can be meaningful and still be irrelevant to the company's primary harm vector. The uncomfortable truth is that a lot of CSR programs are built around what is emotionally compelling, not what is operationally material. They focus on what looks good in a video montage because what's material is boring. Procurement clauses, internal chargeback models, supplier reporting, and teams arguing about boundaries. If you want a clean way to think about it, use the core footprint rule. Real CSR attacks the core footprint, the thing the company does at scale to generate revenue. If the company sells oil, the core footprint is extraction and combustion. If the company sells compute, the core footprint is power, hardware supply chains, and physical infrastructure. CSR that doesn't touch the core footprint is not CSR, it's brand risk management. That doesn't mean the intent is evil, it means the architecture is dishonest. Systems follow incentives, not feelings. So when someone claims impact, ask 3 questions. First, what changed in defaults? If nothing changed in defaults, behavior didn't change at scale. Second, what changed in budgets? If nothing changed in budgets, the organization didn't pay for the claim. Third, what changed in accountability? If nobody can be wrong, nobody can improve. That's the fraud boundary, not vibes, not tone, mechanisms. Now apply that boundary to Microsoft. Ignore speeches, ignore ads. Look at the artifacts, what Microsoft reports, what Microsoft charges itself internally, and what Microsoft productizes as governance for others. Because those 3 things reveal what the company is actually doing when nobody is clapping. Microsoft's environmental commitments, what they actually claim. Now Microsoft, not as a logo, as an operator of planetary scale compute with a sustainability story attached to it. Microsoft's environmental commitments, as they publicly state them in their sustainability reporting, are straightforward on paper, become carbon negative by 2003, and by 2005 remove from the atmosphere the carbon the company has emitted since its founding in 1975. That's the headline claim, and it matters because it's not a promise to do better. It's a promise to hit a measurable condition. Removals exceed emissions within a defined timeline, and historical emissions get addressed, not just future ones. They also position parallel targets around water and waste, water positive and zero waste, because carbon isn't the only constraint that turns computing into a physical industry. That matters because it signals Microsoft understands this as a resource problem, not a public relations theme. Data centers don't just burn electricity. They interact with water availability, local infrastructure, and supply chains that produce actual material waste. But the big one, the one everyone fixates on, is carbon. And Microsoft's framing is intentionally 2-layered. Layer 1 is reduction, lower the emissions associated with operations and the value chain. Layer 2 is removal, compensate for the part they can't reduce fast enough by purchasing or enabling carbon removal. That split is not moral philosophy, it's systems engineering under constraint. The reason this is the Microsoft case study is that they're not just declaring goals. They're building mechanisms around those goals, disclosures, internal economics, and productized measurement. Start with how they talk about renewable energy and infrastructure. In the sustainability narrative, renewables aren't presented as personal virtue. They're presented as infrastructure strategy, long-term power procurement, operational resiliency, and a way to bend the emissions curve of electricity consumption. Again, not a sentiment, a control lever. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Microsoft's footprint matters because digital stopped being small. Cloud is an industrial consolidation of compute. It takes what used to be thousands of inefficient server rooms and concentrates it into hyperscale facilities that are designed, financed, and operated like infrastructure. That already changes the sustainability equation. Then AI arrives and turns the dial again. More accelerators, more dense racks, more cooling, more power delivery, more hardware churn. So Microsoft is now selling compute while claiming climate leadership in the same breath. That is not hypocrisy by default. It is simply what happens when a company's product is the thing that creates the footprint. In other words, Microsoft can't decouple the sustainability conversation from product strategy because the product strategy is the emissions strategy. This is also why their sustainability commitments can't be judged like a consumer brand's commitments. For a software company in 2005, going green could plausibly mean buying offsets, switching office lighting, and calling it a day. For a hyperscaler in 2026, the footprint is dominated by infrastructure growth and supply chains. The posture has to be different because the physics is different. Now, the audience should notice what Microsoft does and does not claim. They do claim specific timelines and outcomes, carbon negative by 2003, historical removal by 2005, because those are auditable targets. They also disclose progress and context in annual reporting, which forces continuity. If emissions rise, the story can't hide it forever. The report becomes a record of drift. They do not claim that growth stops. They do not claim that compute demand politely levels off, so sustainability becomes easy. Their commitments implicitly assume the opposite. Growth continues, therefore governance has to get sharper. And that's where the tension shows up. Microsoft has a business model that scales by selling more cloud and more AI capability. That's the success condition. But the sustainability commitments set a parallel success condition. Reduce and remove fast enough that the net claim holds. These are competing optimization targets inside the same company. That distinction matters because it reframes the whole debate. The question isn't, does Microsoft care? The question is, can Microsoft maintain a deterministic sustainability model while scaling an inherently physical platform? And the answer depends on whether commitments become enforcement. Targets are intent. Intent is cheap. Systems drift without control because exceptions accumulate. A new region here, a new workload class there, a supply chain constraint, a procurement shortcut, a customer demand that overrides the default. So the only way to treat these commitments seriously is to treat them as architecture requirements. They have to bind decisions. They have to constrain design. They have to show up in budgets and procurement and engineering trade-offs. Next, we need to clean up the foundational misunderstanding that makes most sustainability discussions useless. Carbon negative isn't a feeling, it's an accounting outcome. The foundational misunderstanding, carbon negative isn't a feeling. The foundational misunderstanding is that carbon negative is an attitude, like eco-friendly but with better branding. It is not. It's a balance sheet claim that only exists if the math survives contact with system boundaries. Operationally, carbon negative means removals exceed emissions over a defined period, using defined scopes, using defined accounting rules. That's it. No inspirational wording can soften that. If the company emits X and removes Y, the claim is true only when Y is larger than X and only when both numbers refer to the same boundary. That boundary is where the argument always hides. A company can say carbon negative but mean scopes 1 and 2 only. Another can mean scopes 1, 2, and 3. Those are not comparable statements. They are different systems, and Microsoft explicitly talks in terms of scopes, which is why the conversation gets messy fast. The closer you get to scope 3, the less deterministic the model becomes. Now separate 3 actions people constantly blur together: reduction, removal, and offsetting. Reduction is cutting the emissions you create in the first place. Efficiency, renewable electricity, lower carbon materials, better logistics, less waste, fewer flights. It's the part engineers instinctively respect because it maps to use less. Removal is pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in a way that counts as durable according to the rules being used. It's not, we did something nice. It's, we created a measured negative flow. In a carbon negative claim, removal is the mechanism that allows the net number to cross below zero when reductions can't keep pace with growth. Offsetting is the broad category that people use to mean we paid someone else, which includes a spectrum of credit types with wildly different properties. Some are reduction credits, some are avoidance claims, some are removal claims. The word offset tells you almost nothing about what happened physically. It tells you what happened financially. That distinction matters because net claims get built on category confusion. Reduction feels like engineering. Removal feels like engineering plus procurement. Offsetting often feels like paperwork. But they all end up in the same spreadsheet, therefore marketing treats them as interchangeable. They are not. And then Scope 3 shows up and ruins the simplistic narrative because Scope 3 is where most companies actually live. Scope 1 is your direct emissions. Scope 2 is your purchased electricity. Those are comparatively measurable because the company can map them to owned assets and utility bills. Scope 3 is everything else. Supply chain emissions, purchased goods, logistics, business travel, employee commuting, and the downstream emissions associated with product use, depending on the category. In other words, Scope 3 is the emissions you cause without owning the thing that emits. That means your carbon accounting becomes an identity problem. You are no longer measuring exhaust pipes. You're measuring relationships: suppliers, contractors, customers, grids, regions, and time. You are building an attribution model for reality, and attribution models are always contested. This clicked for me when I started treating carbon accounting like authorization in a distributed system. You can make a clean claim about who owns an action inside one tenant. But Scope 3 is cross-tenant by design. It's a graph. It has missing data, inconsistent standards, and incentives to underreport. So if you want a deterministic security model, you enforce it by design. If you want deterministic carbon governance, you need the same thing. Enforcement built into purchasing, budgeting, and deployment decisions, not just reporting. So the unavoidable conclusion is this. You don't audit intent, you audit flows. You audit energy consumption, hardware purchases, logistics, travel, supplier reporting, and removal procurement. You audit the boundaries and the deltas. You audit whether a carbon negative outcome is being achieved through real reductions, credible removals, or simply accounting choices that push emissions outside the declared boundary. And once you accept that, the whole tone changes. The question stops being, do we like their sustainability story? The question becomes, is their carbon control plane capable of maintaining integrity while the platform scales? Microsoft tried to answer that with an internal market mechanism. Make carbon behave like a budget line item so teams feel it without being asked to care. That's where we go next. Artifact 1, the internal carbon fee, carbon as a budget line. Microsoft's internal carbon fee is the first artifact that matters because it's not a slogan. It's an accounting mechanism that creates consequences. And in systems terms, consequences are what separate governance from theater. The publicly described model is simple. Since 2012, Microsoft has charged internal business divisions a fee per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, or TCO2e, tied to the emissions associated with their activity. Not a shadow price that lives in a spreadsheet for moral education. A real charge that hits budgets. That distinction matters because the moment a number affects a budget, it stops being a values conversation and becomes an optimization problem. The fee is designed around the emission scopes used in greenhouse gas accounting. It covers Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 categories as Microsoft expanded the program over time. In plain language, not just direct emissions and electricity, but also the broader value chain categories that normally let companies shrug and say, that's not ours. Microsoft didn't remove the ambiguity because Scope 3 is still messy, but it did something most organizations avoid. It pulled the mess into the internal economic model anyway. There's a reason they did that. Scope 3 is where the platform lives, hardware supply chains, logistics, employee travel, and the emissions associated with operating at global scale. If you don't charge for Scope 3, you incentivize the organization to push emissions into the category that doesn't count. You build a perverse control plane. You reward the behavior you claim to hate. And the fee is not static. Microsoft has revised and increased it over time, including a redesign described in sustainability disclosures around 2022 to accelerate progress. And they've talked about escalating specific components like business travel to higher per-ton pricing. The exact rate isn't the important part here because rates change. The architecture is the important part. Microsoft treats carbon as a unit cost that gets louder over time, specifically in areas where the organization has historically treated emissions as background noise. Now, what happens to the money? Microsoft's disclosures describe the proceeds being reinvested into sustainability initiatives, energy efficiency work, renewable energy procurement, lower carbon operations, supplier decarbonization efforts, and related investments. This is the second half of the mechanism that people ignore. If you charge a fee and then send the money into the void, you've built a tax. If you charge a fee and reinvest the proceeds into decarbonization, you've built a closed-loop system. Behavior gets pressured, and the pressure funds the tools to reduce future pressure. It's the same idea as a well-designed internal chargeback model for cloud spend. You allocate cost to the thing that caused it, therefore teams have incentive to reduce it. Then you use some of the recovered money to fix the underlying inefficiencies. Nobody calls that virtue. They call it governance. This is the part where most organizations mess up because they want the branding of internal carbon pricing without the political pain of actually charging business units. They deploy shadow pricing. Shadow pricing is emotionally safe. It's also operationally weak. Real chargeback changes behavior because it competes with other priorities in the only arena that matters: budget planning, quarterly targets, and business unit performance. It forces a meeting. It forces trade-offs. It forces someone to say out loud, we can afford this feature, but we can't afford the emissions that come with it at this internal price. And that sounds dramatic. It isn't. It's just how systems behave when you make externalities internal. And this is why the carbon fee is an operational artifact, not a marketing asset. It reveals Microsoft's theory of change. Their theory is not convince every engineer to care. Their theory is make carbon behave like cost, therefore engineers will optimize it because engineers optimize constraints. But there's a third piece baked into the fee that creates both power and risk. It depends on measurement integrity. The fee only works if the emissions attribution model is defensible. If the data is wrong, teams will optimize the wrong thing. If the boundaries are fuzzy, teams will argue the accounting instead of changing behavior. If exceptions multiply, the program becomes another example of conditional chaos. a control plane that exists on paper while the underlying system routes around it. So yes, the internal carbon fee is the most structurally serious thing Microsoft does in sustainability governance. It turns carbon from a moral narrative into a budget line. But incentives don't create truth. They amplify whatever measurement model you built. And that's why the next section matters more than people want it to. Carbon accounting is not an emissions problem. It's an identity problem. Measurement reality. Carbon accounting is an identity problem. If the internal carbon fee is the enforcement mechanism, carbon accounting is the identity layer underneath it. And identity layers always disappoint people because everyone expects clean answers from messy systems. Carbon data is not the truth about emissions. It's a set of claims about activity. What happened, where it happened, what was consumed, and who should be held responsible for it. That's an attribution problem. And attribution problems don't get solved by good intention. They get solved by boundaries, definitions, and relentless refusal to accept close enough when money and accountability depend on the number. Scope 1 and Scope 2 are comparatively sane because they map to owned assets and purchased electricity. Vehicles, generators, buildings, utility bills. The accounting can still be wrong, but at least the object model is stable. The company can point to a thing it owns and a meter it pays for, therefore the claim has a fighting chance of being deterministic. Scope 3 is where determinism goes to die. Scope 3 is dominated by supplier data, logistics assumptions, and category-level emission factors. It is emissions by proxy, and that means the carbon control plane becomes probabilistic. The company estimates, models, and aggregates values that are partially observed and often delayed. It isn't fake, but it is not the same kind of truth as a power meter. That distinction matters because once carbon numbers become budget relevant, people will treat them like cost. They'll ask for precision, they'll argue, they'll want to route around the charge, and the system will respond exactly like any distributed system under load. It will find the weakest boundary and exploit it. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The moment you start charging teams for carbon, you create an incentive to fight identity, not behavior. Teams don't wake up thinking, how do we emit less? They wake up thinking, why is our number so high and why are we paying for it? That's rational. Budgets are finite, and if the accounting model can't explain itself, the program turns into an internal tax dispute, not an emissions reduction mechanism. So measurement integrity isn't a nice to have, it is the program. Carbon accounting must do 3 jobs at once. First, it has to map activity to an emitting reality, energy consumption, travel, hardware purchases, supply chain inputs. Second, it has to map that reality to a boundary, what counts inside the company's claim. Third, it has to map the boundary to responsibility, which team owns the decision that caused the impact. That third one is the identity problem. In cloud terms, this is like trying to charge back network egress without knowing which service generated it, or trying to allocate security incidents to a team when the system spans shared services, managed identities, and inherited permissions. If you can't tie the event to an owner, you can't change behavior. You can only publish reports, and reports don't fix systems. Incentives do. Now layer in the distortion effect. People optimize what gets measured and they ignore what doesn't. If the program measures travel emissions well, travel gets optimized. If it measures supplier emissions poorly, supplier emissions become a negotiable story. And over time, that creates a governance asymmetry. Teams get punished for the measurable category and rewarded for moving impact into the unmeasurable one. That is how carbon programs become theater without anyone explicitly trying to commit fraud. The system drifts toward whatever measurement tolerates. The other distortion is boundary gaming. If the accounting is based on averages, teams will chase the average. If the accounting is based on categories, teams will debate categories. If the accounting is lagging by a year, teams will treat it as historical trivia. And if the accounting relies on suppliers, suppliers will learn what answers keep them in the preferred vendor list. None of this is cynical speculation. It is how incentives behave. So the governance truth is simple. Accuracy determines whether the carbon fee changes engineering decisions or becomes another compliance ritual with a finance wrapper. The fee amplifies the measurement model. If the model is defensible, the organization optimizes reality. If the model is weak, the organization optimizes the accounting. And this is where the carbon control plane starts colliding with the current era of growth. Because the workloads being added now are not small, steady, and predictable. They're spiky, they're GPU dense, they're tied to regions with grid variability, they're supply chain heavy, they're AI growth stress tests the whole model, attribution, scope 3, procurement, and regional power. It forces the company to answer a question it would rather avoid. When emissions rise, is that drift, or is that the cost of scale? Microsoft's reporting admits the uncomfortable part. Platform growth changes the baseline. The carbon control plane has to keep functioning anyway. That's next. Microsoft's emissions trend. The platform grows, the carbon grows. Microsoft's public sustainability reporting creates an awkward moment that most companies try to avoid. It forces the organization to say what happened, not what it wished happened. And what happened in the disclosed totals is that emissions increased from 12 million TCO2e in 2002 to 17 million TCO2e in 2023, driven by the build-out required for AI and data center growth. That number matters, not because it proves virtue or fraud, but because it exposes the system collision point. The carbon control plane is trying to impose constraints while the product strategy is trying to scale capacity. Those objectives can align over long horizons, but in the short run, they fight like rival schedulers. Most listeners hear emissions rose and immediately reach for the easiest story: hypocrisy. It's the comfortable narrative because it removes the need to understand the mechanics, but hypocrisy is a motive claim. The more accurate diagnosis is architectural. The platform grew, therefore the footprint grew, because infrastructure is physical and AI is not a rounding error. If you want to understand why this happens, stop thinking in annual goals and start thinking in multipliers. AI doesn't just add more workloads, it changes the shape of the infrastructure: higher power density, more specialized hardware, and faster hardware replacement cycles driven by performance demands. That pulls the emissions profile in two directions at once. Operational emissions rise because data centers consume more electricity. Scope 3 emissions rise because the supply chain for hardware scales up and supply chains do not decarbonize on your timeline. So the platform doesn't fail sustainability by growing. It reveals the constraint that sustainability claims were always trying to negotiate. Growth creates emissions now, and reductions take time. That means the carbon negative target isn't a simple reduce to zero narrative. It is a balancing act across reductions, renewables, and removals, under pressure from customer demand and competitive urgency. This is where the internal carbon fee stops looking like a moral program and starts looking like what it is: a throttling mechanism that tries to make growth more expensive in the dimensions that matter. But throttles don't stop growth if the business can afford them. They just change how the growth is shaped. They move workloads, they change purchasing decisions, they create internal fights about efficiency that otherwise never happen. And that's the first uncomfortable lesson for any admin listening. A carbon control plane is not designed to make emissions always go down year over year. It is designed to ensure that when emissions go up, it happens with eyes open and with explicit trade-offs. That sounds like a low bar. It isn't. Most organizations don't even get to "we understand why this happened." They get to "the report is due." Now, this is also where the narrative gets sharper. If Microsoft's emissions rose into 2023, how does the company still claim a path to carbon negative by 2003? The answer isn't magic, it's removals. Microsoft's disclosed reporting has already conditioned the audience to the idea that the 2003 target depends on scaling carbon removal procurement to handle what reductions can't. In their own framing, they anticipate needing single-digit millions of removal credits annually by 2003. That detail matters because it exposes a dependency. The carbon negative claim is no longer only an engineering target. It is also a market dependency on the availability and quality of removal credits at scale. And that's the second uncomfortable lesson. Sustainability targets don't just depend on your behavior. They depend on markets you don't control. You can build efficient data centers. You can negotiate renewable energy contracts. You can pressure suppliers. But if your net claim depends on removals, then you inherit the risks of a young, stressed, and politically contested carbon removal market. Not because Microsoft is unique, but because net claims at hyperscale require flows that the world hasn't historically produced in bulk. So emissions rising isn't the scandal, it's the symptom. The real story is that the unit economics of compute are colliding with the unit economics of carbon. The platform wants to scale faster than the decarbonization stack can keep up. Therefore, the control plane has to extend into procurement, finance, and removal contracts just to keep the claim coherent. This is the open loop you should keep in mind as we move forward. When growth drives emissions up, the only way to hit a net target on schedule is to buy negative flow. That's not a moral judgment, it's an architectural consequence. And it puts the next battleground in the right place. Removal procurement becomes part of the control plane because it's the only lever left that can move fast enough to compensate for growth that already happened. Carbon removal, procurement, buying time, buying risk. So now the carbon control plane extends into the least comfortable domain for engineers, procurement. When Microsoft buys carbon removal, it isn't doing something symbolic. It's acquiring a negative flow to counterbalance positive flows it couldn't eliminate fast enough. That's what carbon negative becomes at scale. Reduction where you can and removal where you can't. The spreadsheet doesn't care which one feels better. The spreadsheet just reconciles. This is where a lot of audiences get emotionally confused. They hear buying removals and assume the company is outsourcing guilt. Sometimes that's true in the broader market. But in Microsoft's case, their own sustainability disclosures make the dependency explicit. If emissions rise while the platform scales, the net claim requires removals at meaningful volume. That's not a PR choice. That's an arithmetic requirement. And Microsoft has been behaving like a buyer, not a commentator. Publicly reported deals show Microsoft securing large quantities of removal credits. In early 2026, Microsoft signed for nearly 5 million tons of removal credits across two structures, about 2 million tons of afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation credits over 9 years via Rubicon Carbon sourced through Kijani Forestry in Uganda, and about 2.85 million tons of soil-based credits over 12 years through Indigo Ag. Those numbers aren't useful because they sound big. They're useful because they tell you Microsoft is trying to lock supply years in advance. That detail matters. When a company signs multi-year removal contracts, it's admitting a structural truth. By 203, removals aren't an emergency lever. They're part of the operating model. You don't buy that way unless you expect to need the flow predictably year after year. Microsoft has also described itself as purchasing more than 10 million tons of durable removals recently. Again, the important point is not the headline. The point is the architecture. They are building a portfolio, not placing one-time bets. A portfolio is a risk management tool. It exists because no single project type can carry the whole claim safely. And safely is the key word, because removal procurement buys time, but it also buys risk. The first risk is quality. Carbon removal credits aren't a single commodity. They have properties, additionality, permanence, verification rigor, leakage, and reversal risk. If those words feel like ESG jargon, translate them into system behavior. Additionality asks whether the negative flow exists because you paid for it, or whether it would have happened anyway. Permanence asks whether the carbon stays stored or whether it returns to the atmosphere later. Verification asks whether the measurement is auditable or whether it's a narrative with spreadsheets. And this is the same problem class as identity and carbon accounting, just in a different layer. You're still dealing with claims about reality. You're just dealing with them through counterparties, methodologies, and contracts instead of internal meters. The second risk is dependency. Once removals become material to your net claim, you inherit market risk, price volatility, supply constraints, methodology changes, and reputational exposure when the public learns that net depends on purchased negative flow. Even if your procurement is defensible, your story becomes hostage to how the broader market behaves. And the voluntary carbon market has never been famous for boring stability. The third risk is moral hazard inside the organization. If teams believe removals will always be available, cheap and politically acceptable, reductions lose urgency. The control plane can drift into a pattern where growth happens first and cleanup gets purchased later. That's not because people are evil. It's because incentives always pick the fastest path unless you enforce a slower, better one. So removals have to be framed correctly. According to many sustainability experts, removals are a last-mile mechanism, not a primary strategy. That framing exists because reduction changes the underlying system, while removals compensate for what remains. If you reverse that order, you build a company that can only stay net by continually buying its way out of physics. That works until it doesn't. And Microsoft is operating right on that boundary. They're scaling AI and cloud capacity, therefore emissions pressure rises. They're also building internal incentives like the carbon fee and publishing annual disclosures. Then they bridge the gap with removals. That's the carbon control plane in its full form. Measurement, enforcement, and procurement stitched into one coherent story that can survive an audit. But coherence isn't the same as victory. Removal procurement is the part of the system that can keep the promise alive while the platform grows. It's also the part that introduces the most external dependency and the most fragile trust surface. And now we can move from corporate strategy to what actually matters for admins, how those incentives change infrastructure decisions inside the machine. Case study 1. Internal carbon fee applied to cloud consumption behavior. Take the internal carbon fee and stop treating it like a sustainability program. Treat it like a behavioral instrument applied to cloud operations. Inside Microsoft, teams don't just use Azure. They build services on top of shared infrastructure. They choose regions, they choose redundancy patterns, they choose whether something runs 24/7 or only when there's demand. And when a carbon fee exists, those choices stop being silent. They become financially loud. This is the core mechanic. You attach an internal cost to emissions tied to operations and services. Therefore, engineers and product owners feel carbon the same way they feel cloud spend. Not because they suddenly became climate philosophers, because their budget now has a line item that punishes waste. Now, here's where most people mess up when they try to learn from this. They assume the carbon fee makes people turn things off. Sometimes it does, but the bigger impact is that it changes how teams argue. Without a carbon price, cloud conversations default to performance, reliability, and cost. Carbon sits outside the trade space, which means it loses every time. With a carbon price, carbon enters the trade space as a constraint with consequences. The meeting changes, the backlog changes, the architecture review changes. Start with region choice because it's the simplest place to see the mechanism. Engineers pick regions for latency, data residency, resiliency, and sometimes pure habit. But carbon exposure differs by where compute runs because the grid behind that region has a different carbon intensity profile and because the supporting infrastructure differs. If the internal accounting model attributes emissions by region and workload, then region becomes more than a map pin. It becomes a cost decision. And that's the first uncomfortable question a carbon control plane forces. If two regions satisfy the technical requirements, why are you deploying to the higher emissions one? In most organizations, nobody can answer that because nobody even asked it. The system never made them. Next, workload shape. Most teams still deploy like it's 2012, always on by default, oversized just in case, and scaled for peak even when peak happens twice a week. It feels safe. It also burns electricity continuously. When carbon behaves like cost, always on becomes an explicit tax you pay every month. Elastic patterns, auto-scaling, queue-based designs, turning off non-production resources, scheduling batch jobs, stop being nice-to-have optimizations. They become budget defense. This is where carbon governance quietly aligns with FinOps. The goal is not morality. The goal is efficiency under constraint. Now add compute intensity and service selection. Different workload architectures have different energy profiles because they drive different utilization patterns. A system that churns through constant retries, oversized instances, and inefficient data movement doesn't just cost more money. It also costs more carbon because wasted compute is still compute. The internal fee makes that visible in a way performance metrics never will. The thing most people miss is that carbon exposure isn't just how much compute you use. It's when, where, and how you use it. A workload running at 10% utilization all month is a carbon leak. A workload running at 80% utilization for a shorter window can be materially different, even if the total capacity provisioned looks similar in a diagram. The fee pushes teams toward designs that match consumption to demand, because demand mismatch becomes billable emissions. And then there's availability architecture, the sacred cow. Multi-region deployments improve resilience. They also duplicate infrastructure. A carbon price doesn't tell you to abandon resiliency. It forces you to stop treating resiliency as free. If a service runs active-active across regions, that redundancy has a footprint. If it runs active-passive with cold standby, that footprint changes. If it uses data replication patterns that increase constant data movement, that has a footprint too. The carbon control plane turns those into explicit trade-offs instead of invisible defaults. You still choose the resiliency level. You just stop pretending it's costless in every dimension. This clicked for a lot of teams only after they saw carbon show up next to cost in the same financial conversation, because that's what makes the decision uncomfortable in the right places. It doesn't ask the engineer to care, it asks the engineer to justify. So the practical lens for admins listening is simple. Treat carbon as a non-functional requirement alongside latency, security, and resiliency. Not a report, a requirement. And once you do that, you get a transferable method. Any workload decision you can already model financially, you can also model for emissions, if your accounting boundary is good enough. Now, before we go further, remember the open loop. If traditional cloud workloads make these trade-offs visible, AI workloads amplify the whole problem. They increase power density, they increase scope 3 pressure through hardware, and they make efficient by default harder. That's why the next case study matters. AI doesn't just consume more, it changes what the platform is. Case study 2, AI workload energy budgeting. Training versus inference reality. AI creates a special kind of organizational self-deception. Because it lives behind APIs and notebooks, people treat it like it's just software. It isn't. It's industrial compute with a user interface. And if you want to understand why Microsoft's carbon control plane gets so stressed by AI, you need one clean distinction that most teams refuse to make until finance forces them to. Training is not inference. Training is the one-time or occasional capital expense. Weeks of dense compute to produce a model artifact. Inference is the operating expense. Every prompt, every completion, every embedding, every classification, repeated forever at production scale. Teams obsess over training because it's dramatic, but the business footprint often lives in inference because that's where usage compounds. This separation matters because the optimization levers differ. Training is where you can choose architecture, dataset strategy, precision, checkpointing, and stopping criteria. You can decide whether you actually need a frontier scale run, or whether you're doing ego-driven experimentation that produces heat. Inference is where you can choose caching, batching, routing, context-length discipline, and model selection. Inference is where good enough becomes an environmental strategy because every unnecessary token becomes a tiny tax that repeats millions of times. So the case study is not AI is energy hungry. Everyone knows that vaguely. The case study is this. Microsoft's sustainability posture forces the organization to treat AI like any other constrained resource, not free because it's cloud, constrained because it's physical. That's why carbon budgeting per AI workload becomes inevitable, not as a moral gesture, as capacity governance. Most organizations already do cost budgeting. This model can't exceed X dollars per month. That's familiar. It's also incomplete because cost is a market signal and carbon is a physical signal. They can correlate, but they're not identical. Power prices, contractual discounts, region choice, and utilization patterns can make cost look acceptable while carbon stays ugly. So carbon budgeting is simply the same discipline applied to a different constraint. Set an emissions budget per model or per workload class, then enforce it with the same seriousness as spend. Here's the practical baseline formula teams use when they want to stop hand-waving. Carbon emissions equal compute hours times power draw times data center efficiency multiplied by grid carbon intensity. Compute hours times power draw gives you energy. Data center efficiency gets represented by PUE because the data center consumes extra power for cooling and overhead. Grid carbon intensity converts electricity into emissions based on where that electricity came from. That's not a perfect model, but it's a useful one because it turns AI is bad for the climate into numbers you can argue with, and numbers are where governance begins. This is also where training versus inference becomes a budget conversation instead of a technical footnote. Training budgets can be managed as projects. The run starts, it ends, you review the footprint. Inference budgets must be managed as product behavior, usage patterns, user experience choices, defaults, and throttles. If you let product design treat inference like an infinite sink, the carbon control plane becomes a spectator sport. This is where the industry's measurement standards start to matter, and not in a nerdy way. The software carbon intensity approach exists to standardize how software workloads quantify emissions, and in December 2025, the SCI for AI specification was ratified to extend that thinking to AI's lifecycle specifically, including the heavy training and data preparation stages that people love to ignore when they only measure inference. That distinction matters because AI systems have two audiences who can act: providers who build and train and consumers who run inference. If you don't separate those boundaries, everyone points at each other and nobody changes anything. Providers say users drove demand. Users say providers chose the architecture. The carbon stays. So an AI carbon budget needs two explicit owners, one for the model and one for the workload using it. Otherwise, you're budgeting AI like it's a single thing, and that's how you get conditional chaos disguised as responsibility. Now, here's the part admins will recognize. AI workloads create the worst possible utilization patterns: spiky demand, high peak requirements, and expensive accelerators that sit idle if you don't shape the traffic. Carbon budgeting forces the same uncomfortable question. FinOps forces: are you paying for capacity or are you paying for waste? And once you start asking that, the optimization options get brutally practical. Reduce compute time, smaller models where they work, better prompts, better routing. Reduce power draw, hardware choice and right sizing. Reduce overhead. Use efficient infrastructure instead of pretending PUE is someone else's job. Reduce grid intensity, region selection and scheduling where possible. None of this is ideological. It's the mechanics of running a physical platform under constraint. And the payoff is that AI stops being a mystical line item. It becomes governable, which is the whole point of a carbon control plane. But to be clear, this budgeting discipline crashes into the next hard limit fast, because even if you optimize models, the data center still has to deliver the power. The data center constraint, power density ends the fantasy. And this is where the conversation stops being about dashboards and starts being about thermodynamics. The cloud industry spent years acting like compute is elastic in the purest sense. You click, capacity appears, and the only real constraint is your budget. That story worked when workloads were mostly CPU, mostly predictable, and mostly tolerant of being spread across commodity infrastructure. AI breaks that story because it changes the density of the problem, not more servers. Denser servers, hotter servers, more concentrated demand for power, cooling, and physical space. And once density goes up, the control plane you thought was abstract gets pinned to a building with wires, pipes, and a local utility that can say no. Start with the basic fact pattern the industry can't market its way around. Modern accelerators pull serious power. Current GPU-class chips land roughly in the 700 to 120 watt range per chip. That's per component. Once you aggregate them into high-density servers, you're talking about multi-kilowatt machines and then racks that trend toward extreme loads. That one shift rewrites the data center design constraints. Air cooling used to be the default because it was operationally simple. Push cold air in, pull hot air out, and pretend the laws of heat transfer are negotiable. They aren't. As rack densities climb, air cooling stops being inefficient and becomes insufficient. There isn't enough airflow in the world to move that much heat out of that much space reliably without burning absurd energy on fans and chilling. So the industry moves to liquid, direct-to-chip liquid cooling at minimum, sometimes immersion or other liquid-based approaches, not because it looks futuristic, but because it's the only path that keeps hardware inside operating temperatures while maintaining reasonable facility efficiency. The moment you move to liquid, the fantasy of data centers are just big server rooms dies. You've built an industrial plant, you need plumbing, monitoring, leak detection, maintenance protocols, and people who understand both facilities and IT. That distinction matters for sustainability because cooling is not an accessory. It's part of the energy model. It drives overhead, and overhead drives emissions. When you hear PUE, you're hearing the data center confess that compute isn't the only thing drawing power. cooling is an entire second system running in parallel, and AI makes that system louder. Now add the grid constraint, which is where reality starts pushing back. Power isn't just a cost, it's capacity. You can't buy what the grid can't deliver to your site on your timeline. And even if the grid can deliver it, the local community might not tolerate the outcome when demand explodes. A widely cited example is Virginia, where data centers already consume almost a quarter of the state's electricity. That's not a climate debate, that's a political and economic constraint. When residents face rising costs and utilities face capacity stress, data center growth stops being innovation. It becomes a governance problem. This is the uncomfortable truth. Cloud growth is now a local infrastructure event. It competes with housing growth, industrial demand, transportation electrification, and basic grid stability. It also inherits the pace of permitting, transmission build-out, and generation projects, which is slower than product roadmaps, slower than quarterly revenue pressure, slower than ship the model. So when Microsoft talks about being carbon negative while scaling AI, the hidden requirement isn't just better accounting, it's power planning, it's site selection, it's long-term energy procurement, it's cooling modernization, it's supply chain coordination for hardware and infrastructure components that are not infinitely available. And this is why sustainability becomes capacity planning, not branding. The carbon control plane can tell you what happened. The internal carbon fee can make waste painful. Cloud for sustainability can make emissions visible. But none of those things conjure electrons out of a constrained grid or make heat disappear from a sealed room. The system is pinned to physics. And physics is the only auditor that never negotiates. Now, this is where the episode earns its title, Impossible Audit, because the organization isn't trying to audit a static footprint. It's trying to audit a moving target whose underlying infrastructure expands faster than decarbonization can propagate through supply chains and grids. So the control plane has to evolve from report and explain into design and constrain. It has to move upstream into architecture patterns, region strategy, workload defaults, and procurement commitments that bake sustainability into the growth engine itself. Otherwise, the pattern is predictable. Emissions rise with capacity, removals expand to compensate, and trust becomes dependent on markets and methodologies that engineers don't control. Once you accept the data center constraint, the next move becomes obvious. Microsoft can't just run sustainability as a corporate program. It has to productize the measurement and governance stack, because at hyperscale, visibility is the only way to get friction into the right decisions. Artifact 2, Cloud for Sustainability, emissions data as an operating system. So the next artifact is Microsoft Cloud for Sustainability. And it's easy to dismiss it as a dashboard for ESG people. That's the comfortable interpretation. In reality, it's an attempt to turn emissions into a managed data domain, collected, modeled, reconciled, and reported with enough structure that it can influence decisions, which is the only point of having a carbon control plane in the first place. Because here's what Microsoft learned the hard way, and what every large enterprise learns eventually: you can't govern what you can't compile. Cloud for Sustainability is essentially an emissions management system. It ingests activity data, maps that activity to emissions factors, and produces outputs that can be used for reporting and operational tracking. That sounds simple until you remember what activity data means in a modern company. Energy usage, travel records, procurement data, supplier disclosures, logistics, and the endless gray area of Scope 3. So this product exists because spreadsheets don't scale, and manual reconciliation turns sustainability into a quarterly panic ritual. It's the same failure mode you see in identity governance. A company can survive on tribal knowledge and exports for a while, and then the system size crosses a threshold, and the only thing left is automation or collapse. Cloud for Sustainability is Microsoft trying to automate, not being sustainable. Automating the ability to make sustainability measurable. That distinction matters. The foundational move is to treat emissions as a first-class dataset, not a slide deck. Data comes in from multiple sources, gets normalized, and then gets tied to an accounting model that fits recognized categories like the emissions scopes. The output becomes something you can query, trend, and audit. And if that sounds like an ERP pitch, good. That's what this is. Emissions as a management system with the implied promise that you can run governance workflows on top of it. You can't enforce what you can't see, and you can't see what you can't model. Now, the key reframing for admins is this. Cloud for Sustainability isn't there to make Microsoft look good. It's there because Microsoft needs an internal and external way to turn carbon into something the organization can route through its existing control mechanisms: budgeting, procurement, and operational review. In other words, it's an attempt to give carbon the same treatment cost already gets. Cost has telemetry, cost has allocation, cost has chargeback, cost has alerts, cost has governance, cost has people who get fired for ignoring it. Carbon historically has vibes. So Cloud for Sustainability is Microsoft saying, enough with vibes. Build the substrate. And this is where the operating system analogy actually earns its place. An operating system isn't the app you launch. It's the layer that coordinates resources, mediates access, and creates a consistent model for higher-level policy. That's what this product tries to be for emissions data, a layer that standardizes how emissions get represented so the organization can build reporting and action on top. Because annual reporting alone isn't control, it's hindsight. The difference between reporting and governance is time. Reporting tells you what happened. Governance changes what happens next by altering defaults and adding friction. Cloud for sustainability sits in that middle zone. If you wire it correctly, it can produce carbon per workload views. It can create a consistent methodology for translating activity into emissions. It can support the kind of accounting integrity an internal carbon fee depends on. It can also create the boring but critical audit trail, where a number came from, which source fed it, and what changed when. This is the part nobody sells in a keynote because it's not inspiring. It is, however, the only thing that survives scrutiny. Now, the limitation, and Microsoft knows this, is that tooling doesn't enforce anything by itself. A management system without enforcement becomes a higher resolution version of the same old failure mode. Disclosure theater, just with better charts. If cloud for sustainability is deployed as a reporting overlay, it will do exactly what overlays always do, produce beautiful artifacts that don't change decisions. The control plane only becomes real when the organization couples the data domain to enforcement points, procurement requirements, design review gates, internal chargeback models, and policy defaults like region justification required or always on must be defended. And so the product is not the control plane, it is the instrumentation layer for the control plane. And this is the uncomfortable truth of enterprise sustainability. The hardest part isn't calculating emissions. The hardest part is making the people who own the decisions feel the consequence of those numbers. Cloud for sustainability can make carbon visible. It can't make you care. That's still your job as the architect to wire visibility into control. And once you do, you discover the next problem nobody wants to talk about. The emissions you didn't even know you had because they live in small automation and low-code sprawl that never went through a real architecture review. Case study 3. Power Platform Governance. Sprawl becomes environmental risk. Now the carbon you don't see. Not the data center, not the AI cluster. The quiet mess that grows inside every Microsoft 365 tenant the moment the business discovers it can ship apps without asking you. Power Platform is productivity acceleration. It's also a sprawl engine. And once you accept that carbon behaves like cost, sprawl becomes an environmental risk for the same reason it becomes a security risk. It creates unmanaged, always-on activity that nobody owns. Most people still frame low-code governance as a security story. Data loss prevention policies, environment strategy, connector control, audit logs. Fine. But the foundational mistake is treating sprawl as a compliance nuisance instead of a resource leak. Because every duplicated flow, every zombie app, every temporary automation that runs forever is compute. It schedules jobs, it triggers API calls, it writes data, it wakes up systems. And at scale, small inefficiencies become a standing order against the grid. Here's how it happens. A team builds a Power Automate flow to sync files, push notifications, or move approvals. It works. Then another team builds the same thing, slightly differently because they couldn't find the first one. A month later, someone builds a third version because the second version broke after a connector permission changed. None of these are malicious. They are rational responses to entropy, but they have one common trait. They run. They run in the background. They run on schedules. They run on triggers that nobody revisits. And because they're just automation, they rarely get cost scrutiny, architecture review, or lifecycle ownership. So the organization accumulates invisible workload. In financial terms, it's like handing out corporate credit cards with no expense review because each charge is small, then acting surprised when the total is ugly. In carbon terms, it's the same pattern with a different unit. You don't get one big emissions event. You get thousands of tiny ones that never stop. This is where the carbon control plane idea becomes useful to admins because it gives you a forcing function that security governance alone doesn't. Security governance says don't exfiltrate data. Carbon-aware governance says stop creating always-on behavior without ownership. That is a different control objective, and it changes what you measure. The thing most people miss is that low-code sprawl creates two kinds of hidden compute. First, direct execution. Flows, triggers, scheduled jobs, connectors, retrees, and polling patterns. Badly designed flows don't just fail, they retry, they fan out, they hammer APIs, they increase execution volume, which increases back-end workload. Second, indirect compute, all the downstream systems you wake up. Every automation that touches SharePoint, Dataverse, Exchange, Teams, or third-party connectors creates activity across multiple services. You don't just pay for the flow, you pay for the chain reaction. This clicked for a lot of architects when they saw a tenant with hundreds of flows still firing every day, long after the business process changed. Nobody removed them because nobody owned them. The flow became infrastructure, Accidental infrastructure. And accidental infrastructure is always expensive in cost, in risk, in carbon. So what does a serious power platform governance model look like when you include environmental accountability? It starts with ownership as a non-negotiable control. Every environment needs a named owner. Every production flow needs a named owner. Every always-on automation needs a justification and a review cadence. If you can't identify who gets paged when it breaks, you also can't justify why it exists. Then you enforce lifecycle, not just access. App and flow inventories aren't documentation projects, they're deletion pipelines. You need a process that finds unused assets, flags them, and decommissions them. Because the default state of low code is not maintained. The default state is abandoned. Now add the part that makes people uncomfortable. You treat background automation as a consumption class, not as innovation, as consumption. You measure it like you measure cloud spend. Number of flows, execution counts, connector usage, error rates and retries, and environments that exist with no active business owner. Those are your leak indicators. You don't need perfect carbon numbers at this layer to improve behavior. You need enough telemetry to identify waste patterns that correlate strongly with unnecessary activity. And yes, this is where Cloud for Sustainability fits, conceptually, even if the product doesn't magically give you a carbon readout per flow. The value is the mental model. Emissions are downstream of activity. If you reduce unnecessary activity, you reduce impact. That's deterministic enough to be operationally useful. Finally, you align incentives. If teams can create environments and automations at zero perceived cost, they will. If you introduce friction, approval gates for production environments, default retention policies, periodic attestations, and chargeback signals where possible, behavior changes. Not because people became better, because the system stopped rewarding entropy. So the case study takeaway is blunt. Power platform sprawl isn't just security debt, it's carbon debt. Not because each flow emits a lot, because the platform makes it easy to create perpetual background activity without ownership, and perpetual background activity becomes infrastructure load. And once you admit that, you can't hide behind it's only low code. Low code is not low impact, it is high scale. Now, after all this governance talk, the next question is the one people always want to jump to early. Are we reducing emissions, or are we just buying the right kind of story? The critical question, reduction or outsourcing guilt. So now we hit the question everyone asks the moment removals show up in the story. Is this reduction or is this outsourcing guilt? And the annoying answer is that the spreadsheet doesn't care about your moral preference, it cares about levers. A serious carbon control plane needs three, and it needs them separated, because each lever behaves differently under pressure. Reduce, replace, remove. Reduce means you emit less for the same outcome. Less energy per transaction. Fewer wasted cycles, fewer flights, fewer trucks, fewer retries, fewer always on because nobody wanted to design autoscaling. Reduction is the engineering lever because it attacks the source term. If you reduce, you don't need to compensate later. The system stays simpler. Replace means you change the energy input so the same activity has a lower emissions factor. This is where renewable electricity procurement and grid strategy live. Replace doesn't necessarily reduce consumption, it changes what powers that consumption. In cloud terms, it's not about fewer CPU cycles, it's about different electrons. Remove means you create a negative flow to counterbalance what remains. This is where carbon removal credits enter. Afforestation and reforestation structures, soil-based sequestration structures, and other durable removal categories Microsoft has discussed in its public reporting and deals. Remove is not a feel-good gesture. Remove is the reconciliation mechanism when the platform's residual emissions refuse to hit zero on your timeline. Now here's where the audience gets trapped. They collapse those three levers into one word, offsets, and then argue about the word. That's not analysis, that's branding warfare. A reduction is not a removal. A removal is not the same as avoiding someone else's emissions. And offset often means we bought something without telling you what physical change occurred, how it was measured, or how long it persists. If you remember nothing else from this section, remember this. A net claim is a systems claim. It lives or dies on boundaries and mechanisms, not on sincerity. So when people say Microsoft is just buying credits, the only useful response is, which lever are they buying and what does the rest of the system do? Because removals can be either the last mile tool in a reduction-first strategy, or they can become the primary mechanism that enables growth without structural change. Same accounting vocabulary, completely different system behavior. This is where Microsoft's internal carbon fee and its measurement tooling matter, not because they guarantee purity, but because they create internal pressure to reduce before you remove. The fee makes emissions expensive inside the organization. That pushes teams toward efficiency, region discipline, and lifecycle cleanup because the organization feels the cost now, not just in 2003. But here's the uncomfortable truth that makes people angry. Removals are structurally necessary in any world where growth outpaces reduction. You can improve efficiency and still increase total consumption if demand scales faster than efficiency gains. Cloud and AI are textbook examples of that dynamic. The platform gets more efficient per unit of compute while total compute demand explodes. Both can be true. And if both are true, then the residual emissions do not vanish on your preferred schedule. Therefore, the organization either accepts missing the net target or it adds removals. That's not ideology, that's arithmetic under scale. So the real ethical question isn't did they use removals? The real question is whether removals are being used to cover residual hard-to-eliminate emissions while the system aggressively reduces and replaces upstream. And that question drags you back to system boundaries because any net claim is only as good as what it includes. If a company draws the boundary tightly, it can look clean by excluding the ugly parts. If it draws the boundary broadly, especially into Scope 3, it inherits uncertainty, supplier dependency, and delayed data. Microsoft talks in scopes and explicitly includes Scope 3 in its framing, which makes the claim harder, noisier, and more attackable. That doesn't make it automatically more true. But it does make the audit more real because the boundary includes the categories where the platform actually lives. So don't ask whether the story feels good. Ask whether the control plane enforces the hierarchy. Reduce first, replace where possible, remove what remains. And then ask the follow-up that makes the whole episode uncomfortable. What happens when the platform grows faster than the removal market can supply credible negative flow at prices the business will tolerate? That's the real stress test, not whether the slogan sounds sincere. And it's exactly why criticism isn't optional. It's part of the audit. Criticism and trade-offs, what a serious listener should challenge. At this point, the worst thing a listener can do is treat this like a morality play. Microsoft good, Microsoft bad. That's not an audit. That's sports fandom with climate vocabulary. A serious listener challenges the system on trade-offs, where the control plane is structurally strong, where it's structurally weak, and where the incentives can drift into theater even when everyone involved thinks they're being responsible. Start with the obvious tension, data center and AI footprint growth versus public commitments. Microsoft's own reporting discloses emissions rising into 2023, driven by AI infrastructure expansion. So the challenge isn't why didn't emissions instantly drop? The challenge is, what is the credible path for reductions to outpace growth inside the time window implied by 203? Because a carbon control plane can force better behavior at the margin, but it cannot wish away demand. If product strategy continues to scale compute aggressively, then the carbon negative claim becomes increasingly dependent on external levers, grid decarbonization and removals. That's not automatically wrong. But it changes what kind of claim carbon negative really is. It stops being an engineering milestone and becomes a portfolio management outcome. Second challenge, removal dependence. Microsoft's large removal procurement makes the 203 pathway legible, but it also makes the claim inherit the fragility of the removal ecosystem. Quality debates, permanence risk, verification limits, and changing standards over time. The listener should not argue about removals in the abstract. They should ask, what fraction of the net claim is coming from reductions and replacements versus purchase negative flow, and how does that ratio change as AI capacity scales? If the ratio trends toward buy more, then the control plane is drifting from system change to financial reconciliation. And because removals are claims about the world, not meters on a wall, the listener should ask about auditability. What gets independently verified, what relies on modeled estimates, and what changes when methodologies evolve. If a net target depends on accounting conventions staying stable, that isn't sustainability. That's a dependency on bureaucracy behaving deterministically. Third challenge, Scope 3 measurement integrity. Microsoft includes Scope 3 in the carbon fee model and in its reporting, which is more serious than many companies. But seriousness creates exposure. Scope 3 is where proxies live, supplier self-reporting, category-level factors, and delayed data. So the question becomes, does the system create supplier behavior change or does it just create supplier reporting improvement? Those are not the same thing. Supplier decarbonization is physical change, supplier reporting is legibility. You need both, but you can accidentally reward the second while hoping for the first. That's the classic governance trap. You measure the easiest signal and assume it represents the hardest reality. Fourth challenge, global inequality and uneven capacity. A lot of sustainability narratives assume every supplier and region can decarbonize at the same pace. They can't. Emerging markets face different grid realities, different capital access, and different regulatory enforcement. So when a hyperscale buyer pushes requirements down a supply chain, the question isn't should they. The question is how the pressure redistributes risk. Does it actually finance decarbonization, or does it simply shift emissions into less visible tiers where audits are thinner and margins are smaller? If the system pushes cost onto the least resilient suppliers, it may create compliance theater and operational fragility at the same time. Fifth challenge, governance versus productization. Microsoft's cloud for sustainability exists because measurement has to scale. But tools create a new failure mode. The organization can confuse "we have the platform" with "we changed the defaults." So the listener should ask where enforcement lives. Which policies force region justification? Which processes block always-on waste? Which procurement gates reject high emissions options even when they're cheaper or faster? If the answer is "we report it," then the control plane is observational, not controlling, and observational control planes are just telemetry. Finally, the regulatory question: should governments regulate big tech sustainability claims more strictly? The listener shouldn't default to ideology here either. Regulation is another control plane with the same failure modes: weak definitions, easy loopholes, slow enforcement, and metric gaming. But without external constraint, net claims become a private language. Companies define boundaries, choose methodologies, and grade their own homework. That's not necessarily malicious. It's simply what happens when the same entity sets the rules and benefits from the outcomes. So challenge the mechanics, not the marketing. If the carbon control plane is real, it should show up in changed architecture defaults, constrained growth patterns, and budget decisions that feel inconvenient. If it doesn't, it's just a report with a better font. Lessons for other businesses: stealing Microsoft's mechanics, not its slogans. So what does the listener do with all of this? Besides nod grimly and forward the episode to the one person who still thinks net zero is a logo. They steal the mechanics, not Microsoft's slogans, not the aspirational language, not the 203 headline that gets copied into a quarterly deck and then quietly forgotten. Mechanics are the only part that survives contact with budgets. The first mechanic is measurable goals that are defined like engineering requirements, not like mission statements. We care about the environment isn't a goal, it's a mood. A goal has a boundary, a unit, and a review cadence. If your sustainability target can't be expressed in the same language as uptime, cost, and risk, it will never compete with uptime, cost, and risk. The system will route around it automatically. That distinction matters because organizations don't fail at sustainability from malice. They fail from ambiguity. Ambiguity is an entropy generator. Every team interprets it differently, and drift becomes the default state. The second mechanic is making carbon budget relevant. You don't need a carbon negative pledge to do this. You need a way to make emissions show up where decisions get made. Cost management, procurement, architecture review, and service ownership. Microsoft uses an internal carbon fee. Smaller organizations don't need to copy the scale. They need to copy the idea. Attach consequence to a metric, therefore the metric stops being decorative. If you can't implement a real internal fee, implement a shadow one. Chargeback is ideal. Showback still works if leadership treats it as real. The goal is not to punish. The goal is to stop waste being invisible. The third mechanic is accountability boundaries. This is where most programs collapse. You need to decide what you're measuring and then decide who owns the decision that drives it. If you can't name an owner, you don't have governance. You have reporting. This is why Scope 3 is such a trap. It's real, it's huge, and it's shared. So you separate responsibility by control. Procurement owns supplier requirements. Engineering owns workload shape and runtime patterns. Facilities owns PUE and cooling strategy. Finance owns incentives. Sustainability owns methodology. If you merge those into a single ESG team, you didn't centralize control. You centralized blame. The fourth mechanic is transparency cadence. Publish progress on a schedule and stick to it. Not because it's virtuous, because it's a forcing function against internal story editing. When you know you have to reconcile the numbers every year, you build systems that can actually produce those numbers. Transparency is a control mechanism for your own organization. And yes, it will be uncomfortable. Good. Comfort is the enemy of governance. The fifth mechanic is treating sustainability as risk management, not charity. This is where the mental model shifts for architects and executives. If your workloads depend on regions with constrained power, sustainability stops being ethics and becomes availability. If your customers face mandatory reporting, sustainability becomes sales friction. If your supply chain can't meet emissions disclosure requirements, sustainability becomes procurement risk. You are not doing good. You are managing constraints that will hit you whether you like the vocabulary or not. Now, there's also an uncomfortable architectural truth that smaller organizations need to hear. You can't solve sustainability with a tool purchase. You can buy platforms that help you model and report. Fine, but tools don't create discipline. Discipline comes from default settings and enforcement points. What gets approved, what gets funded, what gets reviewed, what gets shut down. So instead of shopping for sustainability software, ask a better question. Where in your delivery pipeline can you introduce 1 unit of friction that prevents 10 units of waste? That's the control plane mindset. 1 gate, 1 default, 1 budgeting rule, 1 ownership requirement. Small constraints applied consistently. And if you want a place to start that doesn't require a reorg, start where Microsoft started years ago. Tie sustainability to procurement and consumption. Make it part of the buying decision and part of the running decision. If it only lives in the annual report, it will never touch the infrastructure. Finally, don't pretend you're auditing morality. You're auditing flows, energy in, work out, emissions attached, responsibility assigned, incentives applied, drift observed, corrections made. That's the whole game. The organizations that win don't care more. They build systems that make the right behavior, the easy behavior, and the wasteful behavior, the expensive behavior. That's what Microsoft's carbon control plane is really trying to do. And that's the part you can copy without having Microsoft's budget, Microsoft's brand, or Microsoft's removal contracts. 1 week implementation. Adopt carbon per workload review. If this episode stays theoretical, it becomes another well-produced artifact that changes nothing. The system will happily absorb it and keep behaving the same way. So here's the 1 week implementation. 1 workload, 1 owner, 1 forcing question, no committee. Pick a single production workload you actually care about. Not the clean demo environment, not the we'll migrate it next quarter zombie. A real thing, customer-facing API, internal line of business app, a data pipeline, a Teams bot, whatever your organization depends on. Now assign 1 accountable owner, not the platform team. 1 person who can answer questions and make changes. If you can't name an owner, you've already found the problem. The workload is unmanaged and everything else is theater. Next, define the boundary. You're not building a perfect lifecycle assessment. You're drawing a box you can defend. What services are in scope? What region or regions? What's the runtime pattern? What's the traffic pattern? You need a boundary because without one, every question turns into an argument about what you didn't include. Then you collect 4 inputs that you already track because this is the trick. The goal is to piggyback on telemetry you have, not invent a new bureaucracy. First, cost per month. Not because cost equals carbon, but because cost is already the organization's attention magnet. You need it as the control variable. Second, uptime and performance. The carbon control plane does not get to break the service. If your sustainability plan requires outages, it won't ship. Write down the SLOs that matter and keep them in frame so nobody plays games. Third, deployment location, region, availability zones, multi-region topology if applicable. This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable fast because we always deploy there is not an architectural reason. Fourth, runtime shape. Is it always on? Does it auto-scale? Do you shut down non-prod at night? Is batch scheduled intelligently or does it run whenever someone remembered to click run? Runtime shape is where waste hides in plain sight. Now you add the emissions estimate. And yes, it will be imperfect. That's fine. Imperfect numbers that change decisions beat perfect numbers that arrive after the budget is spent. Use a consistent method. Energy as a function of compute time and power draw, adjusted by data center overhead, adjusted by grid intensity for that region. If you have vendor-provided estimates, use them. If you have internal factors, use them. The key is consistency over precision. You're trying to see direction and magnitude, not litigate decimals. Once you have those inputs, ask the forcing question. If carbon were priced like cost, would you still deploy it this way? That question is the entire control plane in one line. It turns carbon from a value into a constraint. And constraints create architecture. Now, don't let the conversation die in hand-waving. You need 1 change you can implement in a week. Pick from this list based on what your review revealed. If the workload is always on for no good reason, implement scheduling or auto-scaling so idle time collapses. The fastest carbon reduction is eliminating dead runtime. If the region choice is habit, do a region justification. Write down the latency and data residency constraints, then identify whether an alternate region meets them. If 2 regions satisfy requirements, default to the lower emissions option. Habit is not a requirement. If the workload is oversized, right-size it. Not by guessing, by measuring utilization and choosing the smallest instance class that meets the SLO. Over-provisioning is just waste with a risk management story taped to it. If batch jobs run at random times, schedule them. This is where you can align runtime with operational realities. Maintenance windows, capacity constraints, and when possible, cleaner grid windows. Again, you're not chasing perfection, you're shaping demand. If the workload is chatty, retries, polling, unnecessary data movement, fix the behavior. Network and compute inefficiency are carbon inefficiency. They are the same bug, just built in different units. And before you stop, write a default policy you'll apply to new workloads. Keep it simple so it survives adoption. New production workloads require region justification, and the default is the lowest emissions region that meets latency, availability, and compliance needs. That's it, 1 line, 1 gate, a tiny amount of friction, applied consistently. Because the real enemy isn't bad intent, it's drift. Drift happens when defaults are convenient and consequences are invisible. This 1 week review forces visibility, then forces 1 decision that makes the next decision easier. Do this once and you'll learn something annoying. Most sustainability strategy is just backlog work nobody was prioritized to do. Put carbon next to cost and suddenly it becomes real work with real owners. That's the point. The carbon control plane is behavioral design. The carbon control plane works only when it changes defaults and budgets, not when it decorates a report with better vocabulary. If you want to make this real, run the 1 workload carbon review this week and see what decision you'd change if carbon behaved like cost. If you want the next layer, how to spot greenwashing versus real governance, watch the next episode in this series and subscribe so you don't miss it.